Be better. Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
This is episode 9 of Transmission. And today we're talking about acting from isolation. What does it look like to work for justice at a time when we're overwhelmed and socially distanced? The stakes are high as crises are often exploited by authoritarian leaders. We're seeing some of this already. Meanwhile, pushing ourselves too much when options are few can be a recipe for overload. So what does it look like to act well in a time when it's hard to know how to act?
Yeah, and this topic really arose out of some of the great comments that we got towards the end of yesterday's broadcast. A number of people were bringing that up and talking about that. So good morning to those folks who are logging on, and we're also really going to encourage those great comments and questions. Don't hold back until minute 30, because then it's a little hard to respond at length. And the comments and questions have been really, really great.
Yeah.
So if we've got anybody new on here, I'm Daniel Wolpert, the director of the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
And I'm Mark Van Steenwyk, director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
Wow. And so, so we've been doing these. This is episode 9. And, when we get to episode 11, we will know that we don't have coronavirus and we actually could do this together. Right, 11 days is what it takes to get sick. That's okay. The outside edge. Usually it's day 5 or 6. And so to me, that's actually one of the issues about this in this area in terms of acting and organizing is really beginning to recognize that the approach that the United States and actually much of the Western world, not all of the Western world, has been taking in this regard is really not necessarily the best approach. And that putting us all in this fairly severe form of isolation is only necessary when you're not doing the testing and contact tracing that can allow you to continue in a non-isolated way. I saw a picture of downtown Seoul yesterday. All kinds of people out and about, of course, all wearing their masks, which is another thing that we're starting to realize is very effective. And, they're going about their lives, right? They're not all cooped up like we are here.
That's interesting. You think, why do you think that is? I mean, I know some of the reasons are kind of obvious. We weren't prepared, but it seems like there hasn't been as much of a scramble as one might expect to shift towards testing and tracing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think it basically is we've picked an approach that's not the best approach. We talked about this a lot in the American Exceptionalism video cast. We have refused to learn from these other countries. And one of the countries I've been reading a lot about, one of the few Western countries that is really doing this is Iceland. And again, they're having tremendous success with limiting cases, with tracking where the virus is, and with not having to social isolate to the same degree that we are. But yeah, I mean, our leadership blew it. Right. Trump is trying to, of course, lie his way out of this as usual. But, he didn't believe that this was real. He didn't believe that we needed to do anything. And we also just have not been very smart. This is another thing I was thinking about the other day, right, is that we actually have people that visit every house in America every day, right? Post office. And we could be sending out masks. We could be sending out test kits. And this is what South Korea did with mask distribution, is they did it through the local pharmacies. And the pharmacies had a couple hours a day when all they did was mask business. And they distributed these masks to every pharmacy in the country for basically at cost, right? So that was the other thing. Nobody made any money on this. And they very quickly got masks out to 63 million people.
Sounds nice.
Yeah.
We can't have good things.
Can't have good things.
I mean, this raises the question, like, so part of the reason this is so problematic to not get this kind of response is it shows how slow our government can be to do the right thing and do justly. And in fact, there are injustices happening. So the EPA is getting kind of tanked, all sorts of threats of different things being closed. Like, I mean, I even read an article, like people are worried that they might, like they're going to underfund the post office, things like that. And there are worse injustices that we're worried about now and in the future. So even though we're in social isolation, injustice is not. It's not worrying about social distancing. And so what does it look like for us to act? Here's the question. What does it look like to work for justice at a time when we're overwhelmed and social distanced? So if people have thoughts, throw them up there. A couple of comments. Maria writes, I've been encouraged by all the families which have been stepping up to homeschooling their children. Homeschooling has the opportunity to teach our children a different narrative and different solutions.
Yeah, and also I love Joseph's comment right before that too. I've been using masks from day one. Several billion Asians, can't be wrong. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, so I think Maria's comment really gets at something that I mentioned a number of days ago, and one of the things that I wrote, which is this idea of creating social isolation groups. Mm-hmm. And again, that once several groups of people have been isolated for 2 weeks, they know that they don't have the virus. And so in theory, they could begin to organize these little kind of mini collectives, mm-hmm. right? And, almost like, intentional communities. And yeah, so that could be homeschooling networks. It could be around kids. It could also be around organizing.
Mm-hmm. There's an article, I'm just going to mention it, and people can Google it if they're interested, from Crime Think, which is an anarchist collective called Surviving the Virus, an Anarchist Guide. Now, maybe you're not into anarchism, but one of the things that anarchists tend to do well is think about direct action and mutual aid and collectives. And so part of it, what it does is it suggests that same idea of creating affinity groups where mm-hmm. become like the primary place where you do mutual aid from, but then also organize out of.
Right. Yeah, Catherine's got a number of questions and comments here.
She writes, yeah, I figure a big part of our bad approach is about money. Our government not wanting to spend money on tests and masks. Corporations not wanting to forego profits. But Americans around me are framing it due to shortages. Shortages is such a, it's a sneaky word, isn't it?
Yes. No, I mean, Catherine, that's absolutely true. And as I said, the Korean example with the masks is great. And, Andrew today about ventilators, right? So in the midst of the crisis, ventilator companies have doubled the price of ventilators, right? So, I mean, it's on the other hand, what the Koreans did is they dropped the price of masks to, I think they were saying the pharmacists were making like 2 cents per mask above cost, right? And so what they did was they dropped the price to make them easier for everybody to get. We're, of course, doing the opposite, which is terrific.
Mm-hmm. And just a follow-up thing from Catherine. For example, I heard California had a relevant pandemic preparedness stockpile and planned years ago, but dismantled it to save a relatively small amount of money.
Yeah. Well, and Trump dismantled the entire CDC pandemic task force a couple of years ago, so that when this hit, all the plans that those folks had drawn up were filed away somewhere. Yeah, and I think Joseph or Joe gets at another thing we want to talk about is the fact that there is a fair amount of organizing happening
Mm-hmm.
amongst low-wage workers who are still having to work. So the Instacart work, the food workers, Amazon workers for some sanitation
Mm-hmm.
strikes. Rent strikes. Joe mentions this drive to get people out of jails. And so, that is one way I think to engage in organizing is however we can support some of these movements that are starting to pop up and happen.
Yeah, and it creates some tensions right now because it's just like whenever there's a teacher strike, you always hear it from both sides, right? That we need to be in solidarity with the teachers, but then there's always people saying, "Oh, those teachers are being selfish and they're putting children's well-being at stake," as though they should just always just accept whatever because children are too important. Right now, there's a lot of that kind of rhetoric coming out around things like Instacart and Amazon delivery because it's so essential. But now is a perfect time to be in solidarity, and there's ways that we can do that by one, not ordering, but then also like checking in on our neighbors, again, mutual aid, finding what they need and being willing to go pick up stuff and drop it off for them,
Mm-hmm.
and doing that sort of stuff. And even locally there was a kind of a drive up march in front of the governor's mansion here in Minnesota. So I know that seems to be a tactic people are using their
Mm-hmm.
cars instead of their bodies, which makes all kinds of sense, especially if you're going to do an interstate shutdown. What a time.
Yeah, really. Yeah. To shut down the interstate that nobody's using.
Joseph writes, now is a time to organize. We have people's attention with little to take up their time. It does seem that people's attention, like I've seen rent strikes before, and they don't get as much attention as they do now because I think our attentions are focused, and we are also understanding the injustice of people unwillingly unemployed and having to pay rent or losing their housing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think though, the tension here with the attention thing is that what a lot of people are also reporting is that they're exhausted, overwhelmed, confused, and so there's all of this sort of trauma, grief, reorientation response going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we need to be compassionate and gentle with ourselves and with each other. But yes, if there are people who actually do find that they have energy, have extra time, are not overwhelmed and overworked, then and I do think that what little attention people have is certainly more drawn to more important things, because we realize there's a lot going on. So we've got another good comment here.
I feel like it is too late to contain the virus in the U.S. How do we still find ways to support each other and public health when both government, corporations, and various individuals are acting out their eugenics nonsense in public while the disadvantaged are either inside or outside in tents? Or like in Nevada, like in squares painted on concrete.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that this is absolutely right. Yeah, containing the virus in the United States is that, as we say, that horse has left the barn. So that's not happening. And so yes, it really is that second issue. So how are we going to support each other and in the midst of all of this? And I do think that, again, this is where the education and the empowerment comes in, right? Because everybody is feeling under siege. You're being told all of this stuff by the government, most of which is either bad information or outright lies, whatever. We're doing the social distance thing because that's kind of the only tool we've got left at this point. And so how can we empower ourselves and each other in our groups and communities, to begin to kind of take charge first of our own lives and of our friends and neighbors' lives, and then, ideally the wider society. But there is a lot of pent-up frustration. I mean, I've certainly heard that in a lot of the people that I've talked to.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see. I feel like within activist cultures, there's often been this divide between the folks who focus on systemic issues, organizing, and then the people who do direct action and mutual aid and kind of more the prefigurative stuff have kind of been seen as separate. But here we see in this moment how they come together, like living in an intentional community where we did all kinds of different alternative experiments, like filtering our own water and things like that. All of a sudden that you start realizing how if enough people do that, you can create alternative ways of providing for food and resources for one another so that you're less dependent on like the official systems. But then it gives you a place from which to, a collective from which to start organizing out of. So all these sorts of skills that a bunch of people know, like we need to figure out how to start skill sharing. Mm-hmm. It's like, again, that's another strong practice in the anarchist community. Like, I don't know plumbing stuff. This is something I've been trying to figure out. Like, okay, I want to have a list of all the things that if they go wrong and I don't have access to that, who I know amongst my friend group who can do that. And then so that we start sharing our skills, like prioritizing our gardening, and instead of like just having my garden, what does it look like? Well, we're going to focus on squash, but you can focus on peas. That kind of stuff suddenly becomes relevant and important when you're thinking about living in a potential mini apocalypse.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also think that again, with groups of people starting to have, I would say the deeper and more serious conversations about, issues of life and death, health and wellness. A lot of what's going on relative to this virus, again, is revealing a lot of our feelings about these things and a lot of our the ways in which our society has created a lot of very unhealthy people.
That's right.
Again, that article that we referred to yesterday, one of the really interesting statistics in there is that in Italy, less than 1% of the people who have died are people who were basically healthy folks. So in other words, over 99% of the deaths were in people that had some other underlying medical condition, many of which were lifestyle related. And so, to really begin to say, all right, look, yeah, our whole world economy and system creates a lot of really unhealthy people, and then a virus shows up and it wreaks havoc, on those folks. And so, what can we begin to do as groups of folks and individuals to really start taking that more seriously and taking our health and our life more seriously? And I think there are a lot of examples of those kinds of discussions and conversations that we can engage in on as small or as large a scale as we can wrap our minds around.
I mean, this to me underscores this shift in conversation I've noticed for a while, and people probably noticed it way before I did. It seems like I was slow on the uptake on this one, but the shift from talking about self-care to community care. We were talking before the broadcast started about mental health and how in Western society, mental health and medicine in general can be a very isolating thing. Mm-hmm. Like, it's something I do alone. I don't talk about it with other people. It's kind of embarrassing to talk about. And so there's no way of thinking about health as a shared activity or nurturing it as a shared activity. And so if I get sick alone. This is kind of what's happening now. And with mental health, there's no like community care plan stuff that ever happens in any conversation I've ever had with a medical doctor or a psychiatrist even.
Right.
So this causes us to maybe think about, okay, we're in an opportunity where, yes, we have to start relying on each other if we're going to get through this. Or situations like this. And so let's use this as an opportunity to start being proactive. What should wellness and taking care of each other look like now that we are not able to rely on the system as robustly as we'd like?
Yeah, and this is one thing I think that people, and again, now bumping up to a big level, this is one thing I think that people don't really get and understand about the issue of redoing our healthcare system around something like Medicare for all, right? So that when you have these very big unified healthcare systems, one of the things you find in terms of issues of payment and how you make those systems work and save money is that you start to emphasize things like prevention and community care, right? Like all those things that you just mentioned. And so, this is something that I think that what we don't realize is that Medicare for all is not just about how do we pay for the same system that we have. It's also about how do we create a healthcare system that is really more helpful to people. And so, for example, in the really big PPO systems like Kaiser, what you see in those systems is that there's a lot more dollars that go toward preventative care, right? And a friend of mine who's a doctor in the Kaiser system, they have all kinds of groups. They have all kinds of preventative educational resources. They have all kinds of social education kinds of resources because that saves money. So let's see.
Something from Catherine here. Can you say more about that unhealthy people concept, Dan? Because I'm really troubled by the common assumption in the U.S. that unhealth is an individual's fault based on toxic myths of ableism, fatphobia, classism, ageism, racism, etc.
Right. Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, our unhealth, the statistical unhealth is again created by the systems that we live in. So again, if you live in a food desert where the only food you can go buy is, processed garbage at the local, non-grocery store, and you become unhealthy as a result of that, that is not your individual fault. That is the fault of a system that has been very intentionally created and maintained. Yes, obviously the unhealth of particularly Black folks in our country is directly the result of racism and the toxicity of that, the stress, the generational stress, again, poverty, all of those kinds of things. The fact that the Farm Bill, as it's called, is really a commodities bill. It's essentially a slush fund that is for producing things that are not food, right? We don't have a farm bill for food. We have a farm bill for commodities. Mm-hmm. So there's many ways, and that's what I said, talking about in terms of this organizing piece, is that organizing for health is about the kinds of things that Mark was mentioning, the community health organizing, and what does it mean to have healthy food systems? What does it mean to have healthy economic systems? All of those have a huge impact on our individual health, far more really than things that we particularly do as individuals.
One of the things I guess I'm not optimistic about this, but one of the things I'm kind of hoping is that maybe this myth that's prevalent that people suffer lack and hardship because of their own fault. I'm hoping that this experience together will push against that, because to me, it's exposing that that's not true, right? Yeah. But speaking as I've lost about 100 pounds because I had bariatric surgery. I'm pretty open about that, but just the way in which fatness is seen as just a sum total of bad choices, and therefore that the primary motivation I receive from others and from our society in general to help me deal with any health issues related to that was shame. Like I've been shamed about it my whole life. not any sort of community, nothing calling in, no solutions that would have been more than me having to individually choose. And so if I'm not working out enough, it's because I don't individually choose to go to a gym by myself and pay the money. All these sorts of things that are all based on individuals figuring out that for themselves. And if they can't, that they're shamed. And it's all tied into these myths of any hardship or struggle or lack of health you have is your own fault.
Yeah.
This should hopefully obliterate that, but I don't think it will. But maybe more people will wake up to this as we're in this together in a very real sense that we're all interconnected into
Right.
systems.
Yeah, and Catherine, why don't you throw that up? Catherine's,
Okay.
sharing some more of the issues, right? And all these things tied together, and again, this individualistic culture and the individualism of corporate capitalism, and again, looking at the two examples, right, of South Korea, very westernized, quote unquote, but also very much a collectivist culture still. So looking at the way they deal with this mask thing versus the way we're dealing with this mask thing, right? And so there, it's like, no, let's help everybody. Let's get a mask to everyone. And they organize and they do it. And here, you have our president saying, well, the state governors should compete against each other, on auctions, trying to get masks for their states. And and then the individual is going to be made to feel bad if I can't find a mask somewhere. And it's criminal, really. I mean, it's just an obscene lack of recognition that we are in this all together.
Just some of the things that she highlights in here, and it shows how interconnected it all really is. Like, It's not just about finding healthy food; it's about access to healthcare, which is hard. Like we've talked about that before. It's really confusing to figure out which doctor you can even go to, and you don't even know what kind of care you're going to get. Because we tend to be on poor people's insurance and live in poor people areas. I can't remember the last time I've been to a doctor who wasn't a resident and kind of knew, which isn't a slam against them, but there's not consistent care. Like, I don't know what I'm going to get. Again, like, then you're having to work hard, crappy jobs in order to pay for your crappy, insufficient medical care, brings about stress. And then because we're individualistic, you don't even know how to do mental health. We can't get our needs met that way either. So it's just, and it spirals. Like before I lost weight, my weight caused me to have a bad back and neck, which caused me to have to be more sedentary. So I was gaining more weight, starting to have health issues, and it was making me depressed, which then reinforced all those things.
Yeah.
And again, the message is it's all your own fault. And these are the sorts of things that are going to start exploding because it's harder to get out and move.
Yeah.
We're isolated more than ever. And so we're going to see a spike of corona unrelated health crises coming out of this that have already been happening that are intensifying.
Well, and they're not corona unrelated. They are going to be corona related, but
they're not caused directly by the coronavirus entering in your body and making you sick.
Yeah. So I do think, again, this is all a litany of hard, terrible things.
It's true. April Fools.
Yeah, the April Fools.
April Fools joke is our lives.
Yeah. Come listen to Transmission for your daily dose of downer information. But to me, the flip side of that always is, and again, example in one of our first issues, when you go to a doctor with a broken bone, you don't want to hear about the fact that 197 out of 198 bones are not broken. You want to pay attention to the broken bone. And so I think the first step in a lot of this work always is awareness. Awareness of the myths that keep us from healthy living and just living. Awareness of what are the problems, so that we can seriously engage them. And I think that, as we've said, this is this unveiling time, this apocalyptic time. where we can really see a lot of these things very, very clearly, which gives us the opportunity to, in whatever way we have time and energy and effort for, begin to address.
Mm-hmm. And with hardly any time left, I think, well, actually, we made it to the 30-minute point. No more questions coming in. This is big stuff. Like we said, it's kind of a bit of a downer. But just to underscore this, there are, all these things that, like, in anarchist sorts of communities or in intentional communities we've talked about, I'm seeing more and more people talk about it. Mm-hmm. Things like dual power, which is what happens when you create alternative institutions instead of the dominant ones. Mutual aid, affinity groups, community care. Well, and here's a comment from Catherine. I think we can learn a lot from all the places and times in the world where people have organized under extremely restrictive conditions and where mass gatherings weren't the main form of action. There are lots. And this is the thing, that all that information is out there. And, people are starting to pull it together. There's articles coming out and there's a lot of noise. But I think people are gaining some skills to cut through the noise maybe in this time to focus on what's important. And even though this is shitty now, like, I have a weird amount of hope that this could be a shifting time for people to start, let's do it differently. We know very clearly this stuff isn't working. Well, let's change it up. And there's lots of examples out there that we can learn from.
Absolutely.
So this is a time for some hope, I think. Unless maybe that's the April Fool's joke.
I was going to say, is that the April Fool's joke?
April Fools instead give in to despair.
All right, great to be with you all. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Yeah. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, Dan.